we can see that our challenge from Pakistan is not because of intrinsic capabilities of Pakistan, but it is because Pakistan has been able to find correct equations with external partners and supporters.
But the question, of course, is that can India make use of the momentum that had been there in India-US relationship for the last few decades?
We have talked about Pakistan and we have talked about China. But now, in the current context also, one question that often is asked, where is our neighbourhood policy going? How do you describe India's position in terms of world order currently?
And I think one of the reasons why today international relations is so sexy and so interesting is because you have very interesting characters dotting international order. If you are the third largest economy in the world will expect you to do much more than what you are doing today. And your people will expect you to do much more, and therefore you see this interest in India's global role, which is rising both within India, but abroad also. There are several questions. What would India do with its power? What is India's policy on this, that?
We trace the development from Prime Minister Nehru to Prime Minister Modi.
As a country where we were consolidating our capacities post-independence to a country that is now consolidating its capacity to play a larger role on the global stage. That China cannot be wished away, but China also cannot be taken at face value.
Hello viewers, welcome to today's conversation. If we look at the world today, many find it confirming to what Gramsci said. The old is dying and the new cannot be born. It's about confusion, it's about changes, it's about flux, and it's about events taking place every day, shaping the understanding of international relations. And in this atmosphere, we need someone who can help us understand the changing circumstances. So today we have an esteemed guest among us, Professor Harsh V. Pant. He doesn't need an introduction, and those who have political science and international relations as their optional can't write a satisfactory answer in international relations without citing his name. But as a way of formality, we need to go into his background. So Professor Harsh V. Pant is Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. He is also Professor, King's India Institute, King's College, London, and he is also associated as Director, Delhi School of Transnational Affairs at Delhi University. Now, his writings are prolific. You may have come across his writings in the newspapers like Hindustan Times or the Indian Express, and his books are also prolific, which you may have come across. Most recently, his recent book covers a wide span of India's foreign policy journey after independence. The book, Power and Purpose, Rediscovering India's Foreign Policy in Amrit Kaal, is as much about the past as it is about the present and the future of India's foreign policy. So we seek to learn from Professor Pant and gain insight into much of what is happening in today's international relations. Sir, very warm welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So to start with, your book, your new book, the title, Power and Purpose. Why is it important for power to have purpose? And why is it important for purpose to be backed by power?
I think the two are mutually reinforcing in international relations, partly because as a nation's capabilities grow, it is expected by domestic audience as well as by the global interlocutors to do its duties, to perform more on the global stage. There is a greater degree of aspiration to play a larger role. If you don't have any purpose behind the power, if your power is not backed by any sense of purpose, then I think there is a challenge that you might end up drifting. And I think to avoid that drift, if you have a framework, if you have a strategic sense of what you intend to do with all the capacities that you have accumulated, it allows you to better able to protect your interests. It allows you to better engage with your friends. It also allows you to take on the challenges, because they also come with the rising power capabilities. So the intent behind the book was to give the readers a snapshot of the last 75 odd years of Indian foreign policy journey, whereby we have mapped episodically our journey from 47 onwards. In fact, it goes all the way to 2023, where we are looking at where India hosted the G20 summit. And think about what that journey tells us about the next 25 years. We are calling it the Amrit Kaal, the golden period, whatever you might want to call it. But I don't think you can disagree with the fact that it's going to be a very, very important phase in India's development. Whatever happens, even if Indian policymakers don't do anything, the sheer momentum will make us a $7 to $10 trillion economy over the next 5 to 7 years. Now, if that happens, you can imagine the weight. If you are the third largest economy in the world will expect you to do much more than what you are doing today. And your people will expect you to do much more. And therefore, you see this interest in India's global role, which is rising both within India, but abroad also. There are several questions. What would India do with its power? What is India's policy on this, that issue? What is it that India can do on Ukraine, on in the Middle East? So I think the questions are rising, and we are trying to grapple with some of the answers. But I think not having a sense of purpose behind it may make it more difficult for us to get those answers.
So, in sum, we can say that that has been the story of India's foreign policy over the course of years since independence. Now, if we see your book, it's about waves or phases of foreign policy in India. And the first wave, 1947 to 1964, coincides with the prime ministerhood of Mr. Nehru. And the last or the fourth phase or the current phase coincides with the prime ministerhood of Mr. Modi as the prime minister. Now, can we trace the development from Prime Minister Nehru to Prime Minister Modi in terms of continuity and change that India's foreign policy has seen?
We can certainly. I think the first phase, the first stage of India's evolution post-independence was certainly about state consolidation. And I think then Prime Minister Nehru embodies that consolidation phase. And I think if you look at Mr. Modi's journey, in a sense, he's also consolidating after the post-1990s economic growth that India enjoyed. And now some of that challenges, how do you consolidate it and make India a much more credible player on the global stage? So in their own ways, both are consolidating. On the one hand, Prime Minister Nehru was consolidating Indian state capacity after independence. In Mr. Modi's case, he's trying to consolidate India's capacities that have developed post-1990s. And I think both are also in the, Prime Minister Nehru was also in search of some purpose. If you consolidate the state, if India becomes this post-colonial entity, what do you do with it? He had his own ideas, whether you think of non-alignment or Asian solidarity. Some of them worked out, some of them did not work out. I think Mr. Modi also has a set of ideas about where India should be going, and therefore this idea of Amrit Kaal has come, that look, by 2047 we want to be a developed country, and whatever needs to be done for that, whether in terms of internal capacity building or in terms of external partnerships, we will do that. So I do think that both prime ministers, of course, they are the bookends of India's journey at this point, but also embody something more than just drifting. I think both had very set ideas. Mr. Modi has a set of ideas, and I think in that space we can see the journey of India as well. That we have come as a country where we were consolidating our capacities post-independence to a country that is now consolidating its capacity to play a larger role on the global stage. And I think both in their own ways have tried to grapple with multiple challenges on the domestic and external front. Both have tried to provide some very sharp answers to those questions. Both have generated a lot of discussion and debate around their policies. And I think that tends to happen when you have leadership of this quality. But it is also interesting that how much of today's debates, and we have just come out of a debate in Indian Parliament on Operation Sindoor, also goes back to Prime Minister Nehru, even when Prime Minister Modi is speaking about it, because I think in some ways a lot that happened in the first 2 decades of India's independence that continues to cast its shadow over what we can do today. So our problems with China, our problems with Pakistan, our problems with our neighborhood, you will always have the shadow of Prime Minister Nehru hanging over it, for good, bad, ugly, whatever it is. And I think that conversation is important, that debate is important, and an understanding of that trajectory is important. So as geopolitical enthusiasts, as those who like international relations, if we don't understand this arc, if we just live in here and now, then we miss a large part of this puzzle, because we cannot explain today's foreign policy if you don't really understand what went on in 1940s and 50s and 60s. So I do think that there is a line that we can draw, there is an arc that we can draw, and that arc embodies within itself a lot of the questions that we have to answer.
Sir, in your answers, we have covered a very long span of history and very broad themes. But common throughout this history has been India's engagement with some of the important actors. So in the UPSC examination, the syllabus would revolve around neighborhood relations and then relations with great powers. So in that context, taking these one by one, if we see over the years, our relations with China as a neighbor has undergone a change. And in one of your previous books, Politics and Geopolitics, you write that 2020 is the year when romanticism in India-China or Sino-Indian relationship is dead for good. If not romanticism, then what is it that describes India's approach to China currently?
I think a greater sense of pragmatism, that China cannot be wished away, but China also cannot be taken at face value. That if the Chinese say we are all for good relations, you don't take them for their word, but what you see in their actions is what is going to determine our policy. And I think in some ways this has been a perennial question with us. We blame Pandit Nehru for 1962. A lot of Indians do. They see that the seeds were sown then. But Prime Minister Nehru was also dealing with a very complex problem in a time and place where perhaps it was not that easy, as India was consolidating its internal capacities, to deal with a neighbor who was bigger, who had greater capacity, and who had interestingly used international structure to its advantage, unlike India. And I think from 62 onwards, we have had this back and forth in our China policy. And we have had this great debate. We have always had people who have maintained that India should have good ties with China, and maybe India can embrace China as a friend. But I think what that understanding often missed was that China has its own plans vis-a-vis India. So we can plan a very romantic disposition vis-a-vis China, but what does China want out of India was a question that was never asked. And I think we often fall prey to that misunderstanding, that only if we do this, we will be able to accommodate China. But China views itself as a great power. It views itself as a power that is now challenging American predominance. Now, in order to challenge America, China has to do certain things with India. And there are only a few countries in the Indo-Pacific that stand in China's way. So for China, therefore, it is important to keep India boxed in South Asia, to keep India boxed in as a regional player rather than push India into that domain. So you see those activities that it does. It constantly, keeps Pakistan as the benchmark through which it will view India. It uses South Asian power as a word for it to describe India. It ensures that India is not on the UN Security Council, because that's out of the 5 permanent members, China is the one country that has not openly expressed its support for India's candidacy as the permanent member. It ensures that if India joins SCO, Pakistan also joins SCO. So it does a lot of things. And in Operation Sindoor, we saw how there is increasingly greater military coordination between Pakistani and Chinese militaries. So China has done everything to box India in. And the question now for India is, from Galwan onwards, what do you do? Of course, Galwan shattered a lot of the myths about trade and investment being good for bilateral ties. People-to-people ties can drive this relationship. Multilateralism can drive this relationship. We know that all of that did not work. Now, of course, as we revive our relations with China post the October 2024 agreement that we have signed on the border, that pushes for disengagement and de-escalation, I think the question for India is that how do you engage one of your most important economic partners? How do you engage one of the most important powers on your periphery? How do you engage a country with whom you have the longest border, disputed border? But how do you engage a country that also continuously is trying to make life difficult for you? And I think what India seems to have decided is that we will, of course, have to engage with China, but we will also have to continue to do our own thing. We will have to continue to build our capacities at home. We will have to continue to build our external partnerships. And I think that seems to be the space that we are entering into. But China will by far remain India's most important challenge, as it has always been. But perhaps we had often in the past ignored that challenge. I don't think now we are in a position to ignore it, and therefore it will constantly come back. The China question will be with us for the foreseeable future, and everything else will revolve around it.
So as the American movie Godfather, we have the line that keep your friends close but keep your enemies closer. So we need to understand China better, understand its intentions better, and at the same time we need to keep on working on our own strengths. And you also mentioned our external partnerships in this context. So bringing a lot of factors together, historical and contemporary, we can see that our challenge from Pakistan is not because of intrinsic capabilities of Pakistan, but it is because Pakistan has been able to find correct equations with external partners and supporters. Earlier it was United States, and it seems that even now it is United States, but certainly to a large extent it is China which has been backing Pakistan. So how does India address this Chakravyu or this nexus?
I think it in some ways this has also been the perennial question for India, right? You go back to independence, post-independence period, and how Pakistan got embedded in the Western-led alliance framework,
Right.
and that made life difficult for India. And then, of course, it became a conduit for Nixon's outreach to China. So, in a sense, the US, Pakistan, China axis was the one that India grappled with post-independence during the Cold War. And as you mentioned, it might be coming back. Although structurally, I still think that a lot of the Pakistan issue at this point vis-a-vis the US is more tactical. That America and Trump in particular is using Pakistan, or seems to be using Pakistan, to achieve his goals vis-a-vis India, which are more related to trade, which are more related to getting a deal done with India. I don't think there is any great strategic convergence between Pakistan and the US, nor is there any great love lost in the broader polity of the US for Pakistan. But the question, of course, is that can India make use of the momentum that had been there in India-US relationship for the last few decades, since the 1990s, in fact. And particularly in the last 2 decades, I think we have seen with the nuclear deal, and then with Prime Minister Modi's very active engagement with the US on defense agreements, foundational agreements, etc. We have moved, remarkably close to the US. And as he mentioned in his speech to the US Congress, that hesitations of history were over. And in that sense, I think what he was signaling was that India, which was always hesitant in openly acknowledging America as a partner, has had no compunction under Prime Minister Modi to do that. But the challenge today is, in the age of Trump, can you do that? And do you think that Mr. Trump's tactics of using multiple pieces of leverage, whether it is Iran, Russia, Pakistan, he has thrown everything into the sink at the moment. Whether that will lead to a broader sense of pushback in the Indian public space. India is a democracy, and you cannot really have an outreach to the US if your public is not with you. So the optics look very difficult, and howsoever strategic it might be for India and the US to work together, and which it is in the long term, I don't think there is any other option for both countries if they want to preserve the existing balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, but to work together. But in the short term, if Mr. Trump continues to pester India by using Pakistan, then the pushback in Indian political system, in Indian public opinion, is going to be so strong that it is going to limit Modi's ability to maneuver, Prime Minister Modi's ability to maneuver, and I think that can be very, very difficult.
Right, and if we look at the phases in your book, the second phase is about shift in events or policy becoming more realistic. So India has had this experience of recalibrating its approach, its policy according to the circumstances. Now, in that phase, you also talk about regional consolidation and antagonisms. We have talked about Pakistan and we have talked about China. But now, in the current context also, one question that often is asked, where is our neighborhood policy going? And I want to ask you this, especially in the context of our smaller neighbors. China is a problem, Pakistan is a problem. But currently, our equations with our smaller neighbors, are they satisfactory? If not, what are the directions in which India needs to work to consolidate its periphery?
I think neighborhood policy has always been a work in progress, because neighborhood, given our structural predominance, has always been a problem. There was never a golden period of India's neighborhood policy, and I think that's very clear if you look at how historically things developed and how the regional powers, regional players started ganging up or taking positions against India, because they felt that India is too big, India has this big brother attitude, and therefore they need to protect their flank. So they came together, they formed alliances, they reached out to external partners. Pakistan started it from the Western alliance structures, but even countries like Sri Lanka, for example, have gone out during the Cold War days and asked for external engagement so that India can be balanced with. So there was never a great period where India had great relations with all the neighbors. It was always a period of ups and downs and challenges. I also use a term which I think in some ways explains a lot of this activity, that you have narcissism of small differences, that you have small differences, but they become so big when it comes to India and its neighbors, because that's a question of identity for them. And you see that when you look at how integral India is to many of our neighbors' domestic politics. The moment you have to put down the other side, you say you are an stooge of India. That's the one big statement you would make, and that would be the to the disadvantage of your adversary. So I think that challenge has always been there. Initially, there were a lot of countries who used Pakistan to balance India. India's problem today is that China is the biggest player now. Economically, China is the largest trading partner of most of our neighbors, including, of course, India's largest trading partner. You also have China as as a country that is increasingly present in infrastructure, connectivity domains. People-to-people ties are expanding with almost all the neighbors of India. So China's growing clout in the neighborhood is very visible. We have seen that China proposing Pakistan-Afghanistan trilateral, Pakistan-Bangladesh trilateral. So a lot of these these things certainly are going to impinge on Indian security. you cannot wish away China in South Asia. They are sovereign countries. They will deal with China on their own terms. I think what India certainly can do is provide a better alternative, provide better developmental support that the neighbors need. And I think that is the reason where we have seen a turnaround in our two countries, Sri Lanka and Maldives. And I think in both the countries it has been quite dramatic. Muizu, of course, came to power on an India Out campaign. But today, if you see Prime Minister Modi's recent visit, India is coming up as a reasonable, credible partner, because India has continued to engage with Muizu despite some of the more adversarial comments and statements that came out from Malé. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, when Sri Lanka was in crisis and China was nowhere to be seen, India was present. India was there, engaged regularly. So I think that makes a difference, that you are present, you are not simply talking about your red lines, but you're also helping your neighbors at times of their need, and that leads to a long-term credibility that allows you to have better sustainable partnerships. I think the ups and downs will continue. We often tend to read everything through an India-China lens. One project goes to China, we say China's gain, India's loss, India's gain, China's loss. I don't think our neighbors look at it that way. They want to benefit from both their neighbors that are doing well economically, and you can't begrudge them that leverage. But I do think that India can do more in terms of providing development partnership that and also project implementation. This perception that India overcommits and underdelivers should not be the mantra. We should be able to stick to our commitments in time, something that China does very well. It may not be of great quality, but if you look at Chinese delivery, it is quite in time, often under the budget. So, and exactly the opposite happens in many of India's cases. It has come down, but I think those are the areas where India needs to work and India needs to engage with. But I don't think the South Asia challenge, the Indian Ocean region challenge is going to go away for India. That is going to be a constant in Indian foreign policy.
So we need to put our neighborhood in order, and that's a constant exercise. There cannot be one achievement where we can say that we have completed this task. So there are two things that I take from this part where you said, A, there was no golden period for neighborhood policy, and B, when it comes to the neighborhood, we often suffer from what is called narcissism of minor differences. So in answer writing also, students sometimes need to use these catchy phrases, which I'm very happy that you have provided us with. Now the next area that we can touch upon, and going broadly with the theme of your book, is 1990s onwards, India is changing. And you say from regionalism to globalism. And we can say that currently also India is, so to say, in a phase where globalism is as important for it. Another aspect which is related with it is how much of the world has changed since 1990s. Post-Cold War order, post-Cold War order, and now post-COVID world order is something that people have been talking about. One, where does India see itself in terms of the world order currently? How do you describe India's position in terms of world order currently? And B, what should India aspire for as far as the future of the world order is concerned?
Two things are happening even as we speak. One is that the world order is changing, and of course, as you pointed out, India is changing. So you have two big shifts happening at the same time. And when you have these two big shifts, you have to assess the implications, because the implications become much more complex to decipher. In some ways, 1990s was the period when both the world and India were stabilizing. You have had long Cold War. After that, you had a victory for America, and Francis Fukuyama was writing End of History. So it seemed as if the world is going to progress on a linear trajectory where free market capitalism and liberal democracy would be the mantras, and everyone would follow the same. There was a great degree of optimism, even when you think of America's China policy. The whole premise was that if only we could integrate China into the global economic order, China would become a country like us. And I think and of course, after that came the decade of terrorism and clash of civilizations, Sam Huntington, all of that happened. But I think the first period, the stabilization period, was interesting because it was defined by unipolar moment. It was that America is the most dominant player, and America's writ ran large across the world. Now, I think that phase was, of course, had to end, and it ended. But we don't really know what has taken its place. Because if you think of the discourse, it is whether it is a bipolar world, whether it is a China-US rivalry or detente, what is taking place here, we don't know. Strategic competition with China was the buzzword till a few months back when we saw that Trump 1.0, then Biden accelerating that process. But suddenly Trump himself is now signaling that he may want a detente with China. If he travels to China, as he's indicating in a few weeks or months' time, then what comes out of that visit? I think that question still lingers. Then there is a question which I think India has espoused of multipolarity, whether this is a multipolar world, whether it is a more nuanced world in the sense that not everything is about US and China. It is also about other actors like India, Brazil, Russia, and of course the global South. What happens to the global South, and whether global South itself can become an important voice in how global governance is emerging. So I think we are at a stage where global order itself is being redefined, and we don't know how it is being redefined because the contours are not clear. Everything that we believed in for a very long time, at least since 1990s, almost all the assumptions have come to naught, right? So we used to think trade would lead to greater stability, political stability. Now we have turned it on its head. We are now saying that we will trade only with friends. So instead of making friends via trade, we are using political comfort, political friendship as the first principle to guide our trading economic relationships. Technology partnerships. We are saying we will only do technology partnerships with certain countries. Similarly, on multilateral institutions, almost all of them are not working that were created post 1945. And the new ones that have been created are the platforms like BRICS or SCO or Quad. All of these have also their own challenges. So from multilateralism to minilateralism to plurilateralism, there is a shift. But we don't know, whether they are effective enough. I mean, we can all complain about multilateralism, but at least it gave the world a framework. Today, we don't have any framework. These are all niche, small partnerships among a small group of like-minded countries, but they are addressing a very, very niche issue. So I think, in a sense, there is a leadership void in place, and countries are becoming more inward-looking. Those who used to talk about globalization and those who used to talk about multilateralism are the ones that are complaining about it most, from issues like migration to global economic interdependence. And those who believed in it and thought that this is important, like India or like global South, they are scrambling as to how do you then create an alternative. So I do think that space is still a work in progress, and India, it gives India an opportunity to be present at this moment when there is a possibility of new things to happen, because old clearly is not working, old order. So the new order, as it emerges, can India leverage its, again you come back to the purpose behind power, can India leverage its power capabilities to shape the structure of the international system that might emerge? India is trying hard. You have blocks and pieces of that emerging, like International Solar Alliance here, CDRI there, India's attempt at HADR with like-minded countries, India's attempt in IORA and IONS to give Indian Ocean a certain degree of credibility, and India's attempt at larger Indo-Pacific in terms of defining the choices of the Indo-Pacific. So all of that is there, but I still think that much more will have to be done to ensure that a global order that emerges India can have a stronger imprint on that in that order.
Surely, as in your book also, you are very clear. In the first phase itself, how India was internationally oriented, you say that it's a representative of its awareness of the duty towards the global community. And that is a story that has not changed. India is keenly aware of its importance. India is also keenly aware of the importance of its own equation with the global community. And you have also mentioned the role of Global South. Now, since we have a paucity of time, one last question that if you can take up, we see that strong personalities, President Putin in Russia, President Xi Jinping in China, President Donald Trump in the United States seems to be the norm today. These personalities, and Prime Minister Modi also, he also has a strong personalities. Now, these personalities seem to be playing an important role in shaping today's international relations. But do you think that this to be a sustained trend, or do you think that this is something that has happened throughout the history and would continue to happen?
See, popular history is always written through the lens of interesting characters. That's how it reaches popular audiences. And I think one of the reasons why today international relations is so sexy and so interesting is because you have very interesting characters dotting international order. So you pick your newspaper, you pick your videos, you pick your social media, you get an insight because they are talking directly to you. Donald Trump posts on Truth Social. Prime Minister Modi tweets his views. It is a direct connection with the people, and I think that's what makes people seem that they are connected to something bigger than themselves. But academic writing is often, which is boring. But I think what it often does is it forces you to focus on underlying factors. That characters tell you a very interesting story, but characters often also make you get lost in the larger din of information. So much information. Trump is saying this, Putin is saying this, Xi Jinping is saying this, but at the end of the day, they are all saying this because they are being moved by certain forces which are beyond themselves. So in a sense, Trump represents something fundamental that is happening in the US. That US is becoming more inward looking. That in the US there is almost a revolt against the liberal
establishment.
Elites. Yes, old establishment, liberal elites, coastal elites, globalization. The American Rust Belt doesn't like globalization. They believe that all the jobs have gone abroad. They believe that these companies that are global in nature, they have not done enough for America and Americans. So I think, and he represents that. So in a sense, while individuals have always been and will continue to drive history, the underlying forces also need to be understood if you have to have a better sense of both what is happening, but also a better sense of what solutions are there for this world order. So I do think that these characters which pervade today's international relations and politics do give us greater joy in terms of learning what is happening and to push us into learning more. But I think it is also a reflection of the weakening foundations of the global order itself. That powerful individuals become central to storytelling or to big events when the institutional framework becomes frayed. And I think that's exactly what is happening. No one seems to be in control. And when no one is in control, people often look for people in positions of power or people in positions of authority or figures in those positions to find answers to their problems. So therefore they believe that Mr. Trump will solve all their problems. They believe that Putin will solve all their problems. And I think that is in a sense a danger, but that in a sense is also a reflection of the times that we live in.
Reflections of the times that we live in. Thank you, Professor Pant, for sharing your views on these important matters with us. And hopefully, reading your book would provide the adequate understanding or the tools for understanding what is happening, what is changing in today's world for the students as well. Thank you very much to all of you. Hopefully, we learned something today.
Thank you.